Hi, this is James Cook. I'm an associate professor of sociology at the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video to entertain some questions and share some responses. I won't say they're the final answers, but they're all about sociology and the ideas behind sociology. These have been asked by some of my undergraduate students at the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'll refer to them by initials rather than by name. But a first question that occurs to my students almost every semester is the essential question: what is sociology? It's a good question. And it's a question that actually I think sociology textbooks don't really address well. Consider Diana Kendall's Sociology in Our Times. What is sociology? According to Diana Kendall, this is the systematic study of human society and social interaction. That's a nice sentence. But it has a problem. If sociology is the systematic study of human society and social interaction, then that's a circular definition, because we know what ology means. It means the study of. So what is sociology? Well, Diana Kendall says it's the study of human society and social interaction. All Diana Kendall is telling us in this textbook is that sociology is the study of social things. It doesn't answer the question: what does it mean to study something social? George Ritzer, Essentials of Sociology, gets us a little bit closer. His textbook definition in Introduction to Sociology is that the definition of sociology is the systematic study, okay, that's the ology part, of the ways in which people are affected by and affect the social structures and social processes associated with the groups, organizations, cultures, societies, and world in which they exist. So that definition is, if I count them, once, twice, three times at least, circular. It's containing the idea that sociology is the study of the social. What is the social? That is the core question. It's not like I'm picking and choosing these textbooks. These are some of the most popular Introduction to Sociology textbooks in the discipline. Here are some more. Giddens and colleagues write Essentials of Sociology and define sociology as the study of human social life, groups, and societies. Dalton Conley, and you may ask yourself, says sociology is the study of human society. Newman, in Sociology, Exploring the Architecture of Everyday Life, characterizes sociology as the systematic study of human societies. So let's look elsewhere, not these textbooks. Most other sociology textbooks have the same problem. I'm not just picking and choosing. If we go back to the American Sociological Review, from the early days of sociology as a systematic academic field, in 1941, Leslie Day Zeleny, in the article in the American Sociological Review, Measurement of Sociation, describes this word, sociation, Sociation, the doing of soc things. What is that? She describes it as the degree of interaction in a group. So there can be interaction that occurs. It can occur within a group. And that is what Leslie Day Zeleny terms sociation. Well, what's interaction? Interaction can be defined as two or more units that could be people, could be groups, could be communities, could be nations, anything that can relate to other things. But they come in contact with each other, and something about the way they come in contact with each other changes each the other. So they come together, they come in contact, and they leave that contact changed. So when people affect one another, when groups affect one another, when communities alter one another, when nations change one another, That is interaction. And it happens within a group. What is a group? A group is a set of individual units. And again, they could be people, but they could be larger objects, anything that interacts. Could be groups, communities, nations, institutions, drugstores, hospitals, pharmacies, what have you. As long as it is a set of individuals that shares a sense of shared identity and interacts more often within itself than with units outside the set, then that's a group. You can simplify that to say that a group is a set of individuals who interact, because one of the things that either people or their larger scale creations, groups, communities, nations, institutions, and so on, when they interact with each other, they come to share meaning. They come to share understandings, beliefs, values, expectations, these things we call culture, the stuff that is traded through interaction. So, the social is, therefore, we can understand from Zelany's point of view, interaction in groups. It's two units changing one another and possibly trading things back and forth, changing one another's states, and belonging to something yet bigger than themselves, a group. And if we look at the pattern of that, then that pattern is called a social structure, and sociology can be thought of as the study of these social structures. Interaction between interacting units and units belonging to entities larger than themselves. And then what happens when that occurs. Notice the contrast here. That's distinct from the question of psychology, which is focused very much primarily on the unit itself. What's going on inside the unit? What happens inside the boundaries of a human body or mind or self? And how does what happens inside a unit change things outside, right? That's starting from the individual and then imagining that individuals combine to make something bigger than themselves. Sociology starts with its emphasis on interaction and is not so much focused on what's going on inside individual units as what happens when individual units, humans, groups, communities, nations, when they come in contact with one another and affect one another through relations between them and through associations belonging to something bigger than themselves. That's the idea of sociology. And sociology is the study of all kinds of patterns that occur in that way. And so the questions for sociology tonight are from students who are interested in starting to understand how it can be that there can be interactions and groups in a structure that changes the world somehow. So student MM has a great question, a really complicated question and a good one. MM writes, does technology create a gap between the rich and the poor? I was wondering how technology can affect people in different ways and wondering if it may hold some answers behind income gaps. Wow, that's a really complicated question because it's trying to at once think about characteristics of societies, of interacting groups and individuals, right? So there's this idea of technology, which is the set of innovations that a nation might have. Then there's the idea about people being affected by technology in different ways, namely rich people and poor people differently. And that somehow income gaps, the amount of income that some people have compared to other people, whether that results from technology or is affected by technology in some way is a really, really big question. It is a central concern of economic sociology, of political sociology, of the sociology of gender, three areas of sociology as a discipline. A classic way of conceptualizing this was developed by one of the founding figures in sociology, the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who in his book Division of Labor in Society made a really famous contrast between two kinds of solidarity, two kinds of ways that societies stick together. He starts by thinking about small-scale societies, really small towns or very small farming communities or hunter-gatherer societies where there aren't that many people who are forming a society, a group of people who are working together and interacting together and who belong to the same overall group. But when it's very small, one of the things Durkheim says is that, well, there are relatively few jobs, or in some cases, everyone has the same job, using the same technology to do the same work. On the other hand, as societies grow in size, they get more complicated. There's a division of labor, and people can spend their lives just looking into very narrow subjects and working on those, which leads to technological development, which leads to the need for different people to become experts in using that technology in order to get what the society needs, which means that there is a division of labor where people are assigned to do different kinds of work using different kinds of technology to produce different things or engage in different services or otherwise help society along. Mechanical solidarity is low-tech and has a lot of equality between people. There's not that much difference between the poorest person and the richest person. However, in an organic solidarity, because there's so much specialization and differentiation of people using all kinds of different technology to different aims, there's going to be, because there are different roles, some of them are going to get rewarded more than others, and you have the emergence of inequality, where some people end up doing very well and other people end up having trouble. So in that way, Émile Durkheim was thinking, among many other things, about the emergence of inequality as a consequence of the development of technology that happens when we get big societies. I'd like to focus on one particular area in which this has been discussed, and that has to do with the question of gaps between the rich and the poor, but also between people in different ways, men and women. And let's think about technology. Joanne Vanek in 1974 published an article in Scientific American, back when it was a scientific journal, titled Time Spent in Housework. And Vanek's article is confronting what might be called a simple technological hypothesis that says technology evens out gaps between rich people and poor people. For instance, the introduction of the dishwasher, the washing machine, right? Things like this. The car. When they are available to enough people in society, and you might say that the car is not available to everyone in society, but it at least is broadly available. Laundry machines, dishwashers, these pieces of technology, vacuum cleaners, tend to be broadly available. They were sold as something that would free up human time. Whether you're rich or you're poor, if you can afford to get a vacuum cleaner, then your house will become cleaner so much faster. So the idea of the technology hypothesis is that the diffusion of technology into a society, like a vacuum cleaner, allows everybody in the society to gain cleanliness a bit more, and therefore it lessens the inequality, and it frees people up to have more time. Well, what's interesting is that Vanek asked the question, is this actually true? And now she's asking this in 1974, And she's looking at time spent on housework in households. And she discovers, as you can see in this figure, that actually over time, the amount of housework that people have engaged in on average has not changed. So we add technology in, and housework continues to happen. What a mystery. So why didn't that make things easier for everybody? Why didn't that cut down on the amount of time in housework? Certainly, if you want to clean a rug and you have a vacuum cleaner, it should be much faster than if you had a broom and are trying to clean a rug. It just takes a lot more time. Well, the sociologist Ruth Schwartz Cohen comes in a decade later in 1984 and publishes an interesting research book called More Work for Mother. It's called, subtitle is The Ironies of Household Technology from the Open Hearth to the Microwave. And so she starts with the open hearth and with lighting before electricity, which was based on coal and oil. So the hearth is putting out in the home all this soot. So are coal lamps and oil lamps. A long time ago, around the turn of the 20th century, houses were filthy with soot all over the place, all over the walls. And it was just understood that that's what houses were supposed to be. So then she notices electricity comes along. It's a technology. It's supposed to make everything easier, right? But she notes what Joanne Vanek did, that the amount of work we engage in actually seems to stay the same. So technology does not necessarily make our lives easier. For Ruth Schwartz Cohen, what she does as a historical sociologist is to document changes in the definition of what clean is. So now, if you're going to clean, having soot on the walls in your house is not acceptable. So you add electricity, you increase the standard at the same time of cleanliness, and so cleanliness is not going to happen. When washers and dryers came out to wash clothes as opposed to an old washboard, guess what? The standard of cleanliness in clothes, the social standard, went up. And so people were spending just as much time engaged in the act of cleaning in the household, despite the introduction of technology. Everybody's working a little bit more. But wait, there's more. What's really interesting about this particular study of the impact of technology on people's lives and whether it changes people for the richer or the poorer, one of the things that happens after 1984 is that the answer starts to change. From the 1980s onward, as the Pew Research Center documents in its questions about the time that people spend in their day, you can see here there are trends in which the amount of time overall spent in housework declines. For men, it goes up a little bit, but that's because they are, over time, spending less time in paid work. And women, on the other hand, are sharply decreasing their involvement in housework, which leads to more rough equality between men and women, right? So there's a gap, but it's lessening. But it's not lessening because men are making that up. They're doing a little bit more housework, but mostly it's that women who are going into the paid workforce are now doing less paid work. So it turns out that in more recent decades, fewer household hours overall are being dedicated to housework. That's really interesting, right? And that was a study that was completed in 2013. Well, at about the same time, in a study released in 2011, again in the American Sociological Review, which is the top journal of sociology in the United States, Jan Paul Heisig comes along and asks this question: who does more housework? Does it change according to the rich and the poor? And how does technology relate to that? So what's really interesting about the way that Heisig answers this question is that there's a cross-national comparison. If you go to issp.org, this is the International Social Survey Program. It's across-national, across many nations. 33 nations in the 2002 data that HISEC uses. Looking at 33 nations and finding out information about who's doing work in the house, how much work are they doing, what's the amount of time that they spend doing it, and then can look at trends from nation to nation to nation and asks this question: does some characteristic of a nation, some variable value that changes in its value, does the change in that value affect something about the difference between rich people and poor people in the amount of work that they do? So that's a question that is getting to MM's concern with technology, inequality, and how it changes people who are either among the very richest versus the very poorest. And what HISEC does is to propose a few hypotheses, a few explanations for differences that might occur between very rich people in a society and very poor people in a society. So let's start with the developmental explanation. The developmental explanation says there's economic development that happens, there's investment in technology, and then technology results in these inventions that diffuse through a society, which means that they spread. So for instance, 15 years ago, there were very few people with smartphones, but now almost all people, certainly a supermajority in the United States, have these things called smartphones, little computers that are also phones. So they diffuse, right? And they're supposed to make our lives easier. Do they? Are they labor saving? Well, if they are labor saving, then and as they diffuse broadly in a society, then it should lift everyone up, rich and poor alike, once enough people get this piece of technology. A vacuum cleaner can do the same thing. It can save everybody a certain amount of time, and therefore it would narrow the differences in the amount of time that people have to spend on all this activities of daily life, whether it's paid work or housework, right? If you're more efficient. So in this argument, economic development plus technological development means that eventually rich and poor alike can buy these relatively inexpensive appliances with relatively low fixed costs. And that means that rich and poor can similarly clean, they can similarly communicate, they can similarly work, and it lifts everyone up. There's less inequality. On the other hand, there's a competing explanation, which is an inequality explanation. And that explanation says that that the difference in housework between rich and poor is going to be steeper in societies with high levels of income inequality and wealth inequality. Income is what you get per unit time. Wealth is what you get to keep. And the argument here for the inequality explanation is, as HISEC explains it, is that when there's greater inequality, right, that leads to a certain set of people at the top having a lot of disposable income or disposable wealth, the amount they've saved over time or the amount that they get per unit time. They have more money to spend. If you have a lot of money to spend and you're at the top, and then you're looking down at the bottom and there's more inequality between the two, a difference between the rich and poor in what they have, then that means that relative to the bottom, the top have more to spend. And the bottom have more desperation. They cost less to employ because they're being paid less, which is why they have lower incomes, which is what creates the inequality. Cheap labor. So the inequality explanation says, well, technology is great when we're thinking about gizmos like smartphones and vacuum cleaners and washing machines and things. But another tool, if technology is a tool, and people can be treated as tools, you can just buy more time by buying people. Not in the slavery sense, but in the sense of purchasing their time, employing them. And the argument here is that when you have enough inequality, the people at the top are just going to be able to buy the time of other people to do their business for them. Whereas people at the bottom are going to be spending all their time in paid work, and then they're going to have very little extra money. They're not going to be able to hire their own maids, and they're going to have also the same amount of housework to do while they're doing someone else's housework as well. What's that? A bigger gap between the rich and the poor in the amount of paid and unpaid labor that they do. So if we look at page 86 of Heisig's 2011 article in the American Sociological Review, we see a few graphs. The graphs on the right are patterns among 33 nations, controlling for all sorts of other factors. The graphs on the left are not controlling for factors, all these things that also impact how much work someone has to do on average in a nation. So we're looking at the average values for different nations, and we can look at both the amount of economic development and then we can also take a look at and consider the question of inequality. So the graphs on the top are talking about automation, this technology score. How much automation is there in society? How much technological advancement has there been? And boy, this is consistent with the development explanation, that the more automation that there is, it seems that overall there is a decline in the difference between rich people and poor people in housework hours. In this case, for Heisig, it's measured by women's housework hours, and this is done because Heisig notes that the majority of the housework in all these nations at this time is done by women. Okay, so it looks like the developmental explanation seems to have some support. The more automated, the smaller the poor-rich difference. Okay, but then there's this other sociological variable, which is talking about the characteristic of the arrangement of society, which is inequality in the society, right? So the Gini coefficient is a number that runs between 0 and 100, where 0 represents a situation in which everybody has the same, whether it's income or wealth, they have the same amount. Everybody has the same amount. 100, everybody has amounts of income and wealth that are as different from one another as possible. So here we're seeing for these countries, which have these two-letter codes, we're seeing Gini coefficients between 25 and 55 or so. And we're seeing that as the Gini coefficient goes up, as the amount of inequality in a nation rises, the difference between the rich housework hours and the poor housework hours also spreads. So that's in line with the inequality explanation. Figure 1 here, which is from page 86 on Heisig 2011, shows support for both hypotheses. And Heisig then goes on to explain. I'm going to read this passage. On a general level, the findings remind us that gender inequalities are often conditioned by economic inequalities. When couples decide or bargain over how to get housework done, their options are fundamentally shaped by financial resources, what they're able to buy in terms of technology or people, which in turn interact with the wider technological, economic, and social environment. What other people are willing to do for a certain amount of money. With respect to the result that the housework income gradient is steeper in more unequal countries, the graphs on the bottom, it is important to see that the prevalence of outsourcing, hiring other people, in high-income households is not simply a matter of how rich these households are, it also hinges critically on the costs of employing paid help. When those on the bottom are paid less as a prevailing wage, it costs less for the rich to purchase their labor. So the more inequality there is, the more benefit that accrues in terms of the cheapness of housework hours filled by others. And so that creates a bigger difference between how much housework the rich are doing and how much housework the poor are doing. This is an example of what seems like a simple question generating a really complicated result. And when we think about complicated results, here's another question. HB asks, as another student, when thinking about COVID-19, were people that came from less thriving countries, were they affected more than the United States? Okay, so let's think about trying to make that a little bit more concrete. So student HB says, thinking about COVID-19, okay, we got that. Were people that came from less thriving countries? Okay. The idea here is that there are countries that are thriving more or thriving less. What could thriving mean? Usually, when people talk about thriving, they're talking about something about resources. Are you getting what you need? Are you able to get through life? So resources can be measured in income per capita, how much people are individually getting. Per capita means per head, capita, head. So income per capita is the average income that a person gets in a country. If you're going to measure it a little bit differently, you could also measure it as gross domestic product per capita. So the total amount of dollars that are generated by a country divided by the number of people in it. That would be gross domestic product, or GDP per capita. It turns out that GDP per capita is measured for countries by the World Health Organization. And also by a number of other countries that gather that economic data. So the World Health Organization also has a measurement of COVID involvement. Okay, so being affected by COVID-19. How could we measure that? Well, one way we could affect being measured by COVID-19 is in total number of confirmed cases. Right? And you might want to standardize that because different populations have different numbers of people. So the World Health Organization says in this graph that you can see here, which is provided to us by Our World in Data /coronavirus. You can find this in other tables there, but it's of data from the World Health Organization. It shows that where every dot or every small piece of text refers to a country, you can see in this scatter plot that actually it's not the case that less thriving nations are affected more, if by affected more we mean have more confirmed cases of COVID. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case. That is, the countries with the higher GDP per capita have more confirmed cases of COVID than the poorer nations. You'll notice in the lower left, there's color coding here by continent. A lot of African nations that are really low in GDP per capita also have very few positive test results. So that's actually an answer of no for HB if we measure it this way. But then, as sociologists, we need to think about why would that be happening. And for that, let's take a look at another chart by the same group, World Health Organization, presented to us by the website ourworldindata.org/coronavirus. It turns out that what is something you're able to do if you have a lot of GDP per capita? Well, you're able to pay for a lot more tests. So we see here that it turns out that countries with more daily tests have more positive daily test results. You only are going to get positive test results if you test for it. And there are nations that have very few daily tests, and so they have very few observed or confirmed cases of COVID per million people. adjusting for population. So the answer comes together to relay the information that you only find confirmed COVID when you measure confirmed COVID, and actually the countries that have more resources are able to look more often. And so in cross-national data, it looks like the rich nations have a lot more COVID. What's most likely is that what they have is a lot more testing that leads to a lot more observation of COVID cases. While in nations like the African nations that you see in the lower left corner of the first chart from the World Health Organization, they have very few tests that are going on. And therefore, very few observed positive cases. So here's a situation in which the way we do measurements and our ability to get out into certain parts of the world and do measurements of the prevalence of COVID versus other places where it's largely going unmeasured because there are very few tests affects the direction of our answer. So we've got a conundrum here. We don't really know what the relationship is because we don't know really how many COVID cases there have been in the world. In some places, we have really good information for this. In rich countries like the United States, there's a lot of surveillance. There are a lot of tests. There's a lot of testing of wastewater. There's a lot of hospital data that's collected. Why? Because the United States has a lot of money to put into collecting that information. In countries where that information can't be collected as systematically because it doesn't have the resources to do it, it doesn't have the money to do it, we just don't know how extensive COVID was. Okay, student KJ asks a question. When educating students, KJ asks, should teachers teach ethical values? If so, what are some? If not, should that teaching fall onto the parents or a combination of both teachers and parents? Okay, so here comes the point where I say, oh, I don't know. What do you think? This is an opinion-based question, or it's a moral question about what is good or what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. That is a feature of something called culture. It's a set of values. Values are the amount of positive feeling we attribute to some action, some behavior, some way of being, or how much negative energy we associate with it. Do we think it's good? Positive value, or bad? Negative value. And it turns out that sociologists, rather than, although this varies between sociologists, rather than focusing on determining what the values should be, instead ask questions about how the world works so that people who have different values can use that information about how the world works in order to figure out how to change it to make it more consonant with their own values, whatever they are. Sociologists study values and the spread of them in culture, where culture is a set of ideas about what's true or not, beliefs, what's good or not, what's appropriate or not, values, and expectations for how we think the world ought to be. And so rather than try to say which values are the right values and which values are the wrong values, which is, by the way, an ethical question. That's a branch of philosophy and possibly political science. Sociologists instead study how it is that different values and beliefs spread through a society or encounter certain communities and don't spread in those communities. Why it is that different values and beliefs occur in the first place and how they spread. So I don't really have an answer for you, KJ, because as a sociologist who's more interested in studying processes by which values spread, I am, as a professional sociologist, less interested in telling you what kind of values you ought to have. Now, one of the things that you can do, however, is that you can, for instance, use some information sociologists generate to evaluate certain value statements. So here's a value question. and it's evaluated by an economist, actually, James Heckman, and others in the study of if we're going to try to change lives, where's the best place to spend the money? We could spend it among the elderly, the middle-aged, young adults, teenagers, children, or babies, or we could even spend money on people before they're born, pregnant people, and the babies that they carry at different ages. So there the value is, where would it be best to spend money for a certain definition of what best is. And for Heckman, James Heckman, who is an economist, value comes from the idea of money. Where can we get the most efficient spending from? And it turns out in a series of studies, Heckman finds out that if you spend $1 to change the life of a very young person, an infant or a toddler, that dollar leads to bigger results across the person's life than spending the same dollar on a teenager. A teenager, you get more results for investment of $1 in some social program like an after-school program or a literacy program or food during the summer. Whatever you spend that money on, it turns out that if you spend it on a teenager, you get a better result than for a young adult. If you spend it on a young adult, you get a bigger bang for your buck than if you spend it on a middle-aged person or an older person. So the answer there can help direct you if you have a certain idea of value, which is like for Heckman, it is, I want the most effect for my dollar. Where then ought I to spend my money? I ought to spend it on young people. But that's presupposing that you have a certain thing you care about, that you want to devote your life to bettering the lives of other people. And nobody can tell you whether that's a good value or bad value as a sociologist from a prior position. That's really something more that a philosopher would do. So I hope that helps, KJ, although it doesn't directly answer your question because it's not quite my field. KB asks another question. Does the use of social media affect how social an individual is in the real world? Are they more social in person or more reserved because of their social life on their device? Okay, so this question is really interesting because it involves variables, that is, attributes of these observed things, in this case, people. So here are a few attributes. One variable is the amount of use of social media, right? So how often you use it. Second, how social an individual is in the real world. That is, how many social contacts do they have outside the internet? And then there is the amount of social life on their device, right? So KB actually recognizes that the amount of sociality you have, the amount that you have social contact with people outside the internet, can be greater or lesser. That's wonderful. And the question is, does one variable, the amount of social media use, affect another variable, the amount of sociality, offline? Well, it turns out that there's been a study in this regard, and a pretty recent one, by Emily O'Day and Richard Heinberg in Computers in Behavior Reports, which is all about computer-human interfaces in what? In interaction. And so they have an article, it's called Social Media Use, Social Anxiety and Loneliness, a Systematic Review. So a systematic review means that they take a look at dozens and dozens and dozens, I believe it's 52 research studies on this question, and they look to see if there are consistent patterns. And what they find is two things. First of all, they find two social characteristics of people, not just one. One of which is social anxiety. How worried are people about what other people think of them? And then there's actual amounts of in-person social contact. And so some people are more anxious socially, and some people are less socially anxious. We know this. We also know that some people have a lot of in-person contacts with people, and some people have very few. And then there's the amount of social media use. Okay, and what has been shown is that when there's increased social anxiety actually people tend to be using social media more. When there's decreased in-person social contacts, less in-person contact, people use social media more. What is not known is which way the effect goes. What's happened is that there have been all these 52 studies. They're cross-sectional, which means that they happen at one moment in time. So we don't know which is affecting the other. It could be that when people are more anxious and they have fewer contacts in real life, what they do is they make up for it by going online more to get what they need. It could also be that when people go online to get what they need, that somehow leads them to be more socially anxious, and that leads them to let their in-person social contacts, their offline contacts, wither on the vine. It could be in either direction, and the answer to which direction the effect goes is that it's not known. We just don't know. The question is unresolved as yet. Okay, another question. This is great. How does the process of socialization contribute to the formation of individual identities within different cultural contexts? Wow, that's a big question. I'll answer the question in this way. Socialization is the idea that individual human being organisms, biological organisms, are part of a species that is something that's called social. And remember, to be social means that you interact with other members of your species, that is, you affect one another, right? As opposed to species that are solitary, that don't interact with one another. And that somehow through that interaction, we become not just biological human beings, but that we become this thing called a person. Somebody that has an identity, to use the phrase that IA coins. In sociology, we'd call this the self. The idea that you have a personality, you have a persona, which is a word that comes from ancient theater in Europe, where the persona was a mask that people would put on. And when they put the mask on, people could recognize the mask. They knew what the character was. And they, therefore, in the theater, they knew who the character was and what they could expect them to do. The idea of personhood, the persona, is that we each adopt, whether it's a costume or a face or some way of being, that tells others who we are and what they can expect of us in our interactions. For instance, I'm a professor. Look, I'm wearing a jacket. Look, I'm wearing a shirt with a collar. And look, it doesn't have a tie on it, which means I'm not a professor of business, okay, among other things. I'm telling you what kind of professor I am by my garb. I'm doing that presentation, and in that presentation, I'm letting you know what you can expect of me. How did I learn that? How did I get socialized? The answer is that it occurs through interaction, and that different cultural contexts, therefore, indicate different environments for learning, right? So we gain an understanding of what the roles are in a society and what the expectations are for people in those different roles by watching, by learning, by observing, by trying to work it out on our own and then experimenting socially and either getting rewarded for getting it right or getting punished for getting it wrong, and bringing all that knowledge inside ourselves and creating a model of how the world works, which we carry around with us, and we develop an identity, which is like, this is who I am. I am James Cook. I am a sociologist. I am an American. I am a man. I am a white person. I am not literally white, right? I'm actually sort of pink and light brown. But I'm white in the sense of a cultural set of expectations, ways that you can expect me to pronounce words, ways that you can expect me to hold my body, questions that you can expect me to ask, questions that you can expect me not to ask. And you would be familiar with those things if you had come in contact with a social group in which that sort of thing was taught. Now, if you go to a university or college, congratulations, you're going to learn it by interacting in that social area. If you don't, you won't. So the answer, how does the process of socialization contribute to the formation of individual identities within different cultural contexts, is that cultural differences emerge because there are differences in who interacts with whom in different settings. So if I were born in a different place, where I didn't have the opportunity to go to college and then go to graduate school, I wouldn't be here speaking to you with the identity of a professor. I wouldn't have been socialized in that way. I might have, I don't know, been a priest, or I might have been a dishwasher. And I therefore would have had a different identity, which I would have learned in a different social setting. So this indicates that if we want to understand differences in society, we want to understand why it is that certain sets of people come to interact with each other and build certain understandings, and other sets of people come to interact with each other and develop different understandings, and that the two are separated from one another. That's segregation of groups and localization of interaction within groups. This is something that's called, it's termed by homophily. You may think of this rule that has been observed over and over as the rule that birds of a feather flock together. Those that are similar seem to associate with one another. Now that can be for two reasons. The first can be that people who are similar to each other may become attracted to each other and then interact. But it may also be that people are similar because they interact. And because they interact, they share similar cultural experiences, values, and beliefs, that we come to classify them as being similar. And that ideas like age and religion and education, what they really reflect is the fact that certain age groups grow up in certain cultural environments, right? And they learn certain things in certain places at certain times. People with different educational levels go to different amounts of schooling for different amounts of time for different purposes. If you only have a high school degree, then you haven't had the experience of college, which leads to a different form of socialization. If you go to a business school versus a liberal arts school, you'll gain different socialization and gain a different identity. And when people come in contact with one another and they interact with one another, they reinforce their similar ideas, creating similar identities. Identity comes from interaction. And interaction with other people teaches us about who we are, what we should be, and what we shouldn't be, right? Which is ideas of values that come in. Okay, RD asks another question. If gender, RD asks, one of two questions that RD asks, if gender is socially constructed, wouldn't that mean that gender norms and gender roles would eventually cease to exist? Okay, so I would say yes, but only if social construction ceases to exist. And one of the neat things about the human species, which sociology is mostly focused on, although you can apply it to interaction between ants or chickens or other biological entities, we mostly focus on humans. If gender is socially constructed, what that means is that gender is built, right? Now that is one model of gender, okay? And this is a timely mention here. It's one that is based on a model developed by Candace West and Sarah Fenstermaker, who are two sociologists in the University of California system, where they work out there as professors. And they've come up with this idea called doing gender. And what they say is that gender is actually something that is built between people when they interact. How? Through a culture. Gender is culture. A culture that emerges by people interacting and figuring out when they interact with each other, who am I? Who are you? What should you expect of me? What should I expect of you? And how are we different? And therefore, how should our differences be reflected in our behavior and our knowledge and our values and things like that? And the idea is that whenever we interact, we build and then rebuild every time we interact this idea of what gender is. This is the idea that gender is based on what we do as people in and how we spread expectations for others in our interactions in tiny little cultures. You can think of, right, athletes. That's a gender category. That's a gender. It has certain expectations for how an athlete should behave. And then you could say, oh, well, there are those emo boys over there, right? So an emo boy is like another gender category. It's a set of expectations. How do you expect a boy who is emo to behave? Well, that's if it's a set of coherent expectations, and you think that a person is going to behave a certain way and think a certain way and do things a certain way. If they're emo, that's a gender. There can be more than one gender. And that's true also among women, right? So you could be a girly girl who dresses in pink and wears dresses or skirts. You could be a tomboy. The clothing and expectations for what a tomboy does is different. That they would, end up getting dirty more often. That they wouldn't wear pink as often. That they would be more interested in what we call boyish things. These are ideas that we have out there. These sets of coherent ideas can be thought of as genders. And how do we arrive at them? We arrive at them by bumping around and talking to each other and figuring that out. That's doing gender. It happens in an interaction. We reward each other and punish each other, reinforce each other, or encourage people to be a little different. And in so doing, they do that back to us. We all figure out what gender means, kind of just stumbling through it in interactions. That's very different than the idea that gender is based on some form of prior being, right? So like the idea that if you are born either with an XX set of sex chromosomes, or if you have a certain body type, by the way, the two don't always go together, but imagining that they did, then you could say, oh, well, gender naturally flows, like biologically, from instinct to result in women always behaving like this. And then XY, or male observable body parts, leads to boyness or masculinity or manness, and that being fairly consistent over time. Now, what's interesting is that this model of doing gender versus just being gender can be tested. First of all, are there only two sexes out there that have all the same biological characteristics? The quick answer is no. There are exceptions out there. And differences, and a lot of variation in body type and chromosomal type. Second, do gender expectations vary? Yes, they do. Absolutely. Look at hair. Okay, that changes. Expectations for hair changes over time. In the 1700s, it was a manly thing to have a powdered wig. Clearly, that's different. You don't see very many men in powdered wigs, although powdered wigs are kind of having a comeback. Right? It changes over time, indicating that it's cultural. And that's what it means to socially construct gender. When people say that, that's what they mean, following this West and Fenstermaker point of view. And I've shared a citation in the video for you to find this book, Doing Gender, Doing Difference, to think about the West and Fenstermaker model. If that's true, then what it means is that as long as people are interacting and they're creating these sets of expectations, which people do all the time, people are filled with expectations for others' behavior, it's what we do as a species, then gender roles won't cease to exist, they will just change. Now, RD has another question, which is a follow-up. Could gender, as a social construct, leave society with continued inequality issues? Inequality issues, meaning not equal. By this I mean, says RD, if gender is a product of society, remember, is a word that refers to the act of interaction between, say, people or between communities or whatever social unit you have, interaction between them, or belonging to something bigger. That's what association is. That's what society is. If gender is a product of society, the act of association, and can be changed or shaped by changes in society over time, could the world continue to face inequalities until the end of time? Yes. If it is true that as we associate with each other, that there are some of us that have more resources, like things like we use, like pens and paper and books and money and trees and broccoli. Okay, some people have more and some people have less. As long as there's some that have more and some that have less, then inequality will be observed among them, and we can measure that. That's one of the things we'll do in Introduction to Sociology as a course. Second, will inequalities exist until the end of time? Well, both in terms of gender and in terms of many other characteristics, like race, like education, like age, we do find that there are consistent, persistent differences among different categories of people. These categories are socially constructed, and then we find that there are different amounts of resources for them. Why? Interesting question. One entire branch of sociology is interested in figuring out why is it that we end up with some categories of people having more and some categories of people having less. And the answers are multiple. And we'll talk about them in Introduction to Sociology. One of the answers is that, let's say for gender, one of the things that people do when they create expectations for people according to how they're categorized by gender. Are you a girly girl? Are you a tomboy? Are you emo? Are you athletic? Are you a man's man? Are you a ladies' man? Are you there's so many different gender categories out there in the world, certainly more than two. If we think of gender as a set of expectations for behavior associated with positions, we have many gender positions in our society. If we have expectations for how people behave, what it is that they'll be interested in, what they ought to do and not do, we should not be surprised to find that people end up sorting themselves according to those expectations, or if they try to violate those expectations, find that they get punished when they violate other people's expectations for how they ought to behave. Both the act of punishment leads to reward and punishment, gaining of resources or loss of resources. And then the sorting of people into different categories over time also means that you get different results. If you give people different jobs, they get paid different amounts of money. If you tell people of a certain type that they belong in one place or not another, who belongs working in daycare? Who belongs working construction? Who belongs in the White House? Who belongs at the diner serving your breakfast? A lot of these things are gendered, and they also get paid different amounts of money. That money means then you're able to go to school or not able to go to school. You're able to afford technology or not able to afford technology. You're able to make certain choices about where to live and send your kids to school and not other choices, which further segregates you away from others and lead to the concentration of ideas about the way the world works, which is like little different bubbles of culture about ideas about the way the world ought to be. So that leads to different results. For different people, results may vary. And as long as we continue to make distinctions that have consequences in the world, those inequalities, yes, we can expect to continue. So that means what? That if we are interested in diminishing inequality, one of the things that we would need to do is diminish the force of those sorting expectations that lead people to end up in one place or another. Okay, last question, and then we'll be done. This has been a nice long question and answer session. Student CH asks, what does folklore affect in our society? And how do folklores form? Well, okay, let's take a look at the word folklore, which is not really a sociological word, but let's look at how it's been defined. In the Oxford English Dictionary, which is available for students at my university, University of Maine at Augusta, by going to uma.edu/library. Click on databases and you can use the Oxford English Dictionary. You cover it with your tuition. And you look up the word folklore. And the dictionary definition in the Oxford English Dictionary is the traditional legends, beliefs, culture, etc., shared by a group of people. Okay, so let's consider that part. What they're talking about is values, beliefs, expectations for behavior. and then the symbols that are used to communicate this. That's culture. Folklore is culture. Now, the second half of the definition is especially of a rural or pre-industrial society. So folklore means people who are poor or pre-industrial or who live in the country. And that would mean that people in the city don't have folklore, except of course they do. Do people have urban legends, beliefs, and culture? Yes. Do they have suburban beliefs, legends, culture, and so on? Yes, they do. So folklore is really synonymous with culture. It's a set of ideas about how we ought to operate, rules for the road, understood things that we believe to be true and not, and how we expect other people to behave. Does that affect our society? You bet. This feature called homophily, this pattern that says birds of a feather flock together, it happens for two reasons. The first is that when people come in contact with each other, right, they bump together and they exchange their expectations. Well, are those two people going to interact again? Possibly, if they understand each other. If they get, that's what it means to get along. People understand each other and they have the same point of view, which means that when they know the rules and the rules are the same, interaction goes swimmingly, right? So people who are already culturally similar are more likely to get along. Second, people who interact with each other and share their ideas back and forth eventually come to share a certain set of values, beliefs, and ideas. They share their stories, they share their legends, right? So if we share our legends, our stories, our beliefs, our culture, then we can come to share the same culture. And that happens through what? Through association. You come into contact with people through either some form of a regularized interaction, that is like if you're neighbors and you bump into each other on the street, or if you belong to a unit that's larger than you, like a neighborhood that brings you together, or a church, you go to the same church, you all talk to each other in the same week, you're going to develop similar ideas. So, society is the structure of interactions that occur between people through which culture spreads. And the set of larger institutions that we belong to, like schools, neighborhoods, clubs, cities, towns, where similar ideas are shared. That's how little units of shared association, communication, belonging to groups, leads to formation of unique ideas, unique culture. You can call that folklore. You can just call it the way things are where I live. Either way, the culture spreads through structure, and the structure is preserved by people interacting with one another that they agree with, a form of segregation by culture. In other words, similar culture leads to association, and association leads to similar culture. So this has been a lot of questions. Here are a lot of responses. And what's interesting is that other sociologists may have different points of view and different answers. But based on the sociological literature that I've shared with you today, here are some answers that are provided by different kinds of sociologists to explain these ideas about association, about inequality, about difference, about structure, and about what sociology actually is in the first place. The study of the context of the pattern of relationships we have with other people, and these larger scale groups, institutions, communities to which we belong, and how they affect our identity, how they change the course of our lives. I'm going to have a second set of questions coming through next week, in about a week's time. And until then, thank you for listening to this question and answer session for Introduction to Sociology.